Let's talk about knitting needles, especially circular needles, and which kinds of tips and needle brands I like working with the best, and what types of needle sizes are ideal for shawls or sweaters. So let's dive into all things knitting needles. First, I want to talk about which needles I use the most and which brands I go to again and again. I'm not too picky about needles as long as they're metal, okay? So I don't knit too much with bamboo, which can be a bit more, they can grab the fibers a bit more and they can feel a bit more secure to some knitters. For me, I like the slippery. The slipperier, the better with knitting needles. So that means metal are my go-to sizes. And I've tried a lot of knitting needles over the years, from interchangeables, fixed, more blunt tips and pointy tips, some textured needles. Some textures have grooves. Some needles have those groove textures on them to grab. I just go for simple, smooth metal needles. So my go-tos are Addi Turbos or Addi Rockets. I like the Addi needles, and Chalgu needles I love a lot. But again, I'm not too picky with my knitting needles. Most metal ones I like, but some cords are a bit different. So I've been pretty happy mostly knitting with Addis. I have a lot of Addi Rockets, and those are really common over here in Europe. You can get them in lots of yarn shops. Some of them have a little bit more of a blunt tip. I usually prefer like the Rockets that have a bit more of a pointy tip, but those are my go-tos. And I also love the Chalgus because the cords are really flexible and they're not too loose, but they're not too stiff. So I've always found that Chalgu cords are really nice to work with. And I also like the points and the joins between the needles. But I think for me, I work with a lot of different metal needles, but for me, what's the most important in my grab and go knitting selection for needles is the length of the needles. I've played with short needles for like sleeves and hats and stuff, but my go-to length is just a really long needle that has a really long cord. So for me, that means anything from a 40-inch, 100 centimeter and up, because I use those for my long shawls, and I just love the versatility of those long circular needles. So that'll be something about this long, will be one of my go-to like shawl needles, because you can use it for sweaters and do the magic loop technique, something really long like this, and you also have plenty of length for those super long I-cord bind-offs to some of my shawls. So when I'm talking about those long bind-offs, you'll reach the ends of some shawls and you might have 600 or 700 stitches. And I find that the stitches usually fit on a 40-inch, 100 centimeter length. So that's the ones I have the most of, are about 100 centimeters long, and they fit a lot of stitches at the ends of the shawls. You can just bunch them up. But those are my go-tos, because when you have that one length of needle that's really long, you can do that magic loop technique and still do your small circumferences or the collars of your sweater or making a hat. So if you're new to collecting needles, I think my biggest tip for new needle collectors is give circular needles a go, and then instead of getting a separate length for every type of circumference, just always get a needle that's a little bit longer, like a 40-inch, 100 centimeter, or even a 47-inch, 120 centimeter length, even longer. And that'll give you more versatility in the things that you can do with just that one needle. So lots of needles. I just keep on collecting my favorite sizes, and I feel like when you're working with needles so much, you're always looking for that size that you need for a project, but it's the one that you have like 20 of, but they're probably in other projects or in your couch cushions. So whenever I'm shopping for new needles, my go-to sizes that I always get again and again for shawls is I get a 3.5 millimeter or a US 4. That's my go-to shawl needle size. Sometimes I use a 3.75 or a US 5, but that's for my fingering weight shawls. My most common one I end up using is a US 4. 3.5 millimeter. So if I'm getting a new needle, I always get 2 of those, just because I know I'm gonna lose one, or one of them's gonna go into a shawl project, but I know myself, I'm gonna wanna cast on another shawl, so I have that backup needle. So I always get a couple of the US 4 3.5 millimeter. And then my favorite size for sweaters, DK weight shawls, I like a US 7, a 4.5 millimeter, because you can use that for the body of sweaters, like the Brie Ornate sweater. And you can also use a US 7 or a 4.5 millimeter for these really beautiful DK weight shawl projects. And again, I just love that you can have one needle, a long needle for a shawl, and you can use that same needle for a sweater, and magic loop for your sleeves and your collar. These are just my go-to habits with needle choices. It's a really particular thing, so I advise you to experiment. You could play with some interchangeables, find some DPNs, double-pointed needles that you like. Every knitter has a different knitting style and a way of knitting and what they feel comfortable with. So if that means you find that wooden needles are just make the perfect tension and feel the most comfortable in your hand for your knitting, then go with what works for you, of course. For me, I just like the metal. I'm a speedy, I just want to get things done knitter, and I'm not too scared about a stitch sliding off the needle. So I like the danger and the efficiency of those metal needles. Quick, slippery, and fast movements. And if a stitch falls off, I just pop it back on. I'm not scared of a drop stitch. But if you like going a little more slowly and like that extra grab in your knitting needles, then definitely those wooden or bamboo needle types are your best friend. This one I have here is actually a weird needle. I believe it's like a 3.8 millimeter. Like Japanese knitting needles have different sizes. So I have a couple from my travels. I have like a couple Japanese needles that are like a 3.5, but they're just slightly thicker, but not quite a 4 millimeter. So yeah, they have different needle sizes in different countries. But I have a couple of those just for fun and for swatching. They're just ever so slightly different. They're these in-between sizes. But my go-tos are the standard needle sizes for Addies, Chalgus. I love working with those. A couple more needle tips and things I use for my projects. Once I have like my go-to needles that I work with, I've found that with sweater knitting, my top tip for sweater knitting, when you're knitting your cuffs or the collar of your sweater, I write this in my patterns. Almost all of my sweaters have one size needle smaller for the collar and the cuffs. And I learned this from Elizabeth Zimmerman and her books about knitting and making your own sweaters, and that using a smaller stitch count or a smaller needle size brings in the fabric and makes it just a little bit more crispy. And I found that I wear those sweaters the most when I have a little bit of a tighter gauge just for the collar, and then I switch one needle size up for the body of the sweater, and I find that it doesn't stretch out as much. So that's my top tip for your first sweater projects. Do it for the cuff as well. It just makes the fabric a little bit more crispy, and it makes it less likely to stretch out over time than if you just use the same needle for the whole project. So it's a really subtle difference. Sometimes you don't really even notice a circumference difference that much. It's just more about the tightness and the tidiness of the fabric, and it just helps prevent it from flaring out too much as you wash the sweater or as you wear it over time. So I did that with the Brie Ornate sweater, and you can see the stitch pattern is a little different too. It poofs out just a little bit in the sleeve, but you can see how crisp and tidy that cuff is. And same for the collar, this folded twisted rib. I just am always happy when I go one needle size smaller, and sometimes I'll even go 2 needle sizes smaller. Just depends on the circumference and how tight and tidy I want it. But I don't think I've ever had a collar be too tight and crisp, as long as it fits over your head. That's the most important part, but yeah, use that trick. And then another trick I use for my fingering weight shawls, or it's not really a trick, it's just a lack of doing something, is there's different size fibers in a lot of my shawls with mohair and alpaca, but my trick is to not adjust the needle size within the same shawl project. So by that, I mean, don't go with a smaller needle for one section and then a bigger needle for the other yarn fiber. Just use the same needle for the entire shawl. And if you're mixing different weights, then my tip is to use the needle that you like with the thickest type of yarn, or the type of yarn that you're using the most of. So if you're using mostly fingering weight yarn, then pick a needle size you like with that fingering weight wool, And if you have some lace weight alpaca or mohair that's a bit skinnier, then just say yes. Don't stress. Use that same needle size with the skinnier yarns, and it's just going to be a more light and flowy effect in those sections. But I wouldn't recommend to change the needle size to coordinate with thicker or thinner fibers in the same project, because then you run the risk of some puckering or one row being a bit tighter and not draping as fluidly. So just embrace using one needle size, saying yes to one needle. Don't stress if some fibers are a little bit skinnier. You could always double up and do 2 strands of a skinny yarn to make it more thick, but just use the same needle size. That's for shawls like the Fantastitch that I'm holding here. So you can just keep it simple with one needle and use that same long needle from cast on to bind off. So those are my top tips. I honestly just love experimenting. So whenever there's a new needle to try, I give it a go and see if I like it. And you can never have enough needles. So practice with some different ones to see which ones are most comfortable for you. And the more you use them, the more you'll get acquainted with how they last and wear over time. But I've been really happy overall with Addies, Addie Rockets. I really love how long they last. And I really love the cords of the Chow Goo along with their tips. And then lastly, one final thing that was a tip that one of my friends told me years and years ago is sometimes the plastic cords, as you work with them over time, or when you roll them up in your knitting bag, if they ever feel a little bit stiff, or if you ever get like a little kink, that happens to some of my cords, where they get this little thing that's not so smooth, you can soak them in warm water, or even hot water, like for your tea, and it helps loosen and relax the cords. So that's a really nice tip that a friend helped me with. It happens when I store my needles and I don't use them for a while. Sometimes maybe the cord feels a little bit stiff, or it feels kind of kinky and coily and you're wrestling with it. Just try dipping it and letting it sit in some hot or warm water for a while and see if that helps loosen up the cord and make it a little more easy to work with. So lots of fun tips to try. If you have some needle tips or some needle brands that you just can't get enough of, if you like interchangeables, what are your favorite interchangeable needles? You can share some of your needle tips and suggestions in the comments down below. I'm always looking for new needles to try. I've tried some carbon needles I really like. There's just so many types out there, but it can be a confusing landscape to see which ones are really worth it or which ones last, which tips are nice. So if you'd like to share kind of what your knitting style is or what your favorite needle is and why you like it down below, we can learn some fun suggestions from each other. So thanks for watching. I love sharing all my tips and tricks with you, and I'm gonna put some of these needles to use and cast on some new works in progress. So I'll see you in the next video.